We are very excited to talk about this important topic with you because wherever we live, in the North, the South, the East, or the West, or in the Heartland, I think all of us have noticed that the weather outside is changing. The patterns are different than the ones we remember when we were growing up. Whether it's their summers that have gotten hotter and longer, or our rainstorms that feel so much more ferocious and dangerous, hailstones that are getting bigger, or tornadoes that are bedeviling areas that used to be deemed safe. How are these events being impacted by climate? What is instead really just being impacted by normal weather patterns or just bad luck? And what can we attribute to climate change? Importantly, what can we expect in the future? And what tools do we have to prepare? And the answers to these questions are really important because not only do these climate changes or these weather patterns impact us and how we feel as far as safety in our homes, in our communities, or on our roadways, it also impacts our economy in big ways and small. In big ways because these weather events are harming big sectors of our economy, including agriculture, energy, water management, recreation, tourism, forestry, fisheries, and the list goes on. And in smaller ways, because it impacts each of us, because as taxpayers, we are on the hook for the cost of these bigger weather events and repairing our communities, and also for the cost of the new infrastructure to prepare, because nature is playing by a new set of rules. To help us really drill down on the nexus of climate change and weather, we have two wonderful meteorologists with us today. The first is Jeff Berardelli, who is the chief meteorologist and climate specialist for the NBC affiliate station in Tampa, Florida. Jeff has over 2 decades of experience in the area, and he may look familiar to us because he was a correspondent covering national climate stories for CBS. Our second guest is Chris Gloninger. He is the senior climate scientist at Woods Hole Group, which is in Massachusetts, but he too has a long tenure in meteorology. In fact, he was the person who first put together a weekly segment on climate while he was a meteorologist in Boston. Subsequently, Chris was in the news because when he moved to Des Moines, Iowa, to be a meteorologist and to bring the messaging that climate change was indeed impacting that community, he ran into some pushback. In fact, he ran into some harassing emails and even a death threat. Now, to be fair, when Chris left the station, he held up reams of emails that were from viewers that were lauding his efforts and commending him for his efforts, for two very different reactions to his efforts to bring the climate messaging into that market. Thank you both for joining us. We are so excited to have you here. So, Jeff, let me start with you and just ask a very basic question, but one that I think kind of sets the table for everyone. What is the difference between climate and weather? And what are the weather patterns that we are seeing that we are sure are connected with climate?
Well, this might take a half hour or so, but no, no, I'm just kidding. We'll make it short. Weather is just what happens on a day-to-day basis, right? The weather, the storms that hit us, a tornado outbreak, a snowstorm, a hurricane. So it's the weather that changes on a day-to-day basis, whereas climate is kind of the average weather pattern over a long distance of time. Maybe that long distance of time is just a few months, or maybe that long distance of time is a few centuries or more. So that's the difference. The climate is the average and how the average changes, which is the climate change. And the weather, though, has a lot of variability day to day. And then the second question you asked is, what specifically do we know climate change is impacting in weather? Well, certainly it's impacting heat waves, right? That's an easy one. You raise the baseline temperature of the whole Earth by 2 or 3 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're going to get hotter heat waves. We also know that it's producing heavier downpours. So extreme rain events are becoming more extreme. Why? Because with a warmer atmosphere and warmer waters, we can hold more moisture in the atmosphere. We can wring more moisture out like a sponge and create bigger floods. But we also think it's impacting the jet stream. We also think that it is causing more rapid intensification of hurricanes, and potentially some of the strong hurricanes are becoming even stronger. The list goes on and on. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but hopefully that gives you a baseline.
No, thank you. And I think heat waves are on everyone's mind after this past summer. We're feeling 100 days over the 100 degrees, and we've been experiencing it in almost all of our communities. Chris, maybe you could help flesh out some of the areas that are not directly tied with climate change, but that we are suspicious of, because it seems like these patterns are changing everywhere and in almost every weather pattern, if I may say. So what do we suspect? What are we not as sure of, but that we think might be linked?
That's a great question, because oftentimes we hear false attribution, where maybe climate change isn't the root cause, or it's the threat multiplier making a system worse, meaning it'll hold more moisture, or the heat wave is a little bit longer. But even the science of attribution is changing. And one of the things we're not as sure of is the impact on severe weather. And that is defined as tornadoes, derechos, higher impact events like that. But the research is improving, which is promising. And in fact, just weeks ago, there was research that found that large hail events, which we weren't really able to make the connection with, large hail events are happening more frequently. And the number of those large hail reports, around 2 inches in diameter or more, which is you start to see damage to roofs and to siding, to your cars, we're seeing more of that. Less small hail, but as the atmosphere becomes more energized, there's more turbulence, there's more lift, we're having large hail reports. So even though like the run-of-the-mill tornado, that's going to be really difficult to fine-tune and see the connection, but we're starting to see progress being made. So you can't call everything climate change, but we're really now beginning with attribution science, Kathleen, to see which events are tied to, whether it be caused by or made worse by climate change. But again, severe weather, one of those parts of this, one aspect of the science where we're still needing some improvement.
You know, it's fascinating because if you look across many different patterns, including hurricanes, and now, as you're saying, with hail, you are seeing that in some cases we're seeing less of the weaker versions and more of the stronger versions, which makes it harder to put your finger on and to explain, because perhaps it's not as frequent. But from a girl who grew up in New Orleans, it's the big ones that you really care about, right? They're the ones that really cause the damage. So that's interesting.
Yeah. That's a really good point you make, because that's what we think is going to happen with climate change. It's possible there may be less tropical systems overall, maybe. We're not sure about that. But what we're pretty sure about is that the stronger systems have become even stronger. And about 85% of the damage in hurricanes is caused by Cat 3s and above. So what you really care about, like you mentioned, are the really major hurricanes, because they're the ones that really cause most of the damage. So that is an interesting aspect you brought up, which is happening also in the hurricane space, we think.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question. Since you are both working or have worked in more conservative areas, do you have a sense that the changing patterns that so many of us are noticing are changing opinions about whether climate change is happening or whether it's something that we need to take action on quickly? And I guess I'll go first to Chris and then to Jeff.
Okay. I do think that there is some momentum when you have these larger events. However, the Yale program on climate change communication and George Mason University, when they do their public opinion polling, which is fascinating, they're still seeing a bit of a disconnect. There's a large number of people that still don't believe that they're being personally affected by climate change, whereas really the majority of us are, whether it be by that longer heat wave, that stronger hurricane, the floods that produced more water and more rainfall. And the other shift that we're seeing is there may be more buy-in in the fact that the climate is changing, but we still have that breakdown in the cause. And that is where you have to look at the politics of it, unfortunately. And I experienced this in Iowa, where you could talk to a farmer who was maybe a little bit more conservative, who would say, yes, the climate is changing, but we just don't know if humans are affecting it. And I love this statement from Anthony Leiserowitz from the Yale program on climate change communication. And he said, climate and atmospheric scientists have more evidence that climate change is caused by humans than smoking causes cancer. And the medical community has that smoking causes cancer. So if people really knew that, I think it internalized it. It would open a lot of minds, hopefully. But we still have that breakdown where it's that political divide, where they see the changes, but they're not quite able to say humans are causing it.
I would concur. I mean, there's so many people I know personally, friends of mine, or people that like, for instance, I often take a ride share to work, and there'll be people in the cab or the driver, and so many people still say this to me, and it boggles my mind, which is, well, but is it really humans that are causing it? Like, there seems to be a disconnect there. I think that Chris is right, that we see this increase in extreme weather. People see it on the news. They think, in fact, that extreme weather is getting more extreme, but they still are not willing or able to say that it's humans that are causing this. And I use the word willing because I oftentimes think that people are very resistant to that, especially depending upon which side of the political aisle they are on, to admitting that humans could be causing climate change if it isn't popular among their group of people.
Right. Well, it's interesting because I think there was just an opinion study that was released in the last week or two, and it showed that there had been quite a lot of movement among liberals and Democrats in saying that the main reason they were concerned about climate change was indeed these weather weirding events, the dangers that they were causing. Amongst some conservative Republicans, actually, the disbelief had increased instead of going in the opposite direction. So it does seem to be very polarized still, like so much of society is today. But one of the things that we do know is that meteorologists are trusted messengers. You guys come into the homes and you tell people how to stay safe, you project the weather. So back about in 2010, a scant majority actually believed that climate change wasn't caused by human, wasn't a big deal. And then by 2020, it was almost 95% the opposite. So in one decade, amazing change amongst your cohort. Can you tell us what it was that brought such swift, and what tools do you have now that make you so confident that climate change is indeed causing these weather challenges? And I'll reverse the order and then we'll start with Jeff and then go to Chris.
Yeah, I think it is a lot of things, right? First of all, there's a lot more information available, and it's available at our fingertips now. 10, 15 years ago, it wasn't as readily available. It wasn't as readily talked about. Also, I think we had a lot of older meteorologists have retired who may not have been willing to accept climate change because they just weren't taught that in school. And a lot of newer meteorologists who were taught climate change in school that are now emerging into the field. I think also I will give a lot of credit to Climate Central. Climate Central has done tremendous work in educating meteorologists and providing them with the resources to use on the air. Without those resources, there's not much we could do because we don't have the time to compile data and statistics. But being able to produce those statistics every week, it not only gives us something to use on the air, but it also gives us something to look at and say, wow, these are some pretty robust changes. And Climate Central has done a really good job at allowing meteorologists to know these resources are there and help meteorologists to understand the climate and also help them to know where to find the resources and how to talk about climate change. And probably, by the way, not be scared of the fact that some of our viewers are not willing to accept the truth about climate change.
And Jeff nailed it. I mean, if you look at climate change and the growth that we've seen, the Climate Matters program started in South Carolina. So, which I think is also a testament to the fact that this is not a political issue. Jim Gandy, one of the first meteorologists to talk about it, was really the grandfather of that program in a conservative part of the state, nonetheless. Not right in Charleston that's seeing rising sea level right out their back door, which you tend to see more buy-in in those communities that see it day to day, right? But meteorologists, you have to keep in mind that we, and I guess in my past life, I'm now referring to it as we since I'm out of TV, but typically hold a myopic view of the weather. we're looking at, 7, maybe 10 days at a time. And then you get to that 10-day period, you reset, and you're not really looking at the trends because you're really focused on how to tell the weather story of the day. And the weather story of the day, as Jeff said much earlier today, is day-to-day weather, not climate. So while as a professional group, we're much larger than just broadcast. We have academia, we have the government, we have the private sector. I think we may have been some of the last in the profession to kind of hop on and see the trends. And I think that's one of the reasons why, because we just have that shorter span of really forecasting the future in just a smaller amount of time.
That makes sense. And I will say that Climate Central is also a group that we look to for a lot of the information that we use in our presentations, and we're very familiar with Climate Matters. And I remember being on an airplane and sitting next to someone who I didn't know and just chatting. And she said, "Did you notice that the meteorologists are talking about climate change?" And she had no idea of what we did. And I thought that was remarkable, because we were talking about the weather, and she was using that as an example of how she was noticing the difference and how she found it credible. But you also said something, Chris, about being short-term in your perspective. And one of the things that as climate communicators, I struggle with, and I think many struggle with, is how do we paint the longer term impacts, the climate impacts that are coming, say, mid-century, in a way that people can understand and accept. Have you had any experience with that? And do you have any tools or advice on how to help people understand that the changes we're seeing today are just the beginning, and what we will see tomorrow will be much more extreme? And Chris, want to start and go back?
I think in my new profession, and Woods Hole Group is an environmental and coastal engineering company. And what we do is we help municipalities, we help private clients, we help states work on climate projections, from modeling probabilistically sea level rise and impacts of stronger storms to doing kind of hazard planning. And we have projects that are extremely complicated. And if you look at the infrastructure that needs to be fixed or improved or rebuilt, the price tag of that, the cost of that, I think would push the priority of climate change up in the issues in our election. One project I'm working on, a 1.25 mile structured roadway, which may need to be raised by anywhere from 2 to 4 feet, may cost anywhere from $100 to $500 million. That's not the stormwater infrastructure. That's the physical lifting of the road out of the critical elevation of that flood zone in the future. That's one road in one town. When you have so many of us that live along the coastline, that is a scary thought about how much this is going to cost. And I say to people, even if you can't really picture storms getting stronger, you might not be able to think about heat waves getting longer. I just ask people, if you're worried about the economy right now, think about billion-dollar disasters happening more frequently than every week and a half to 2 weeks. Think about what happens when insurance companies continue to pull out of communities. Think about the infrastructure that needs to be replaced or revamped. That is an economy that could be in trouble. So worry about the economy still, but look at it in the future and what climate change will do. And I think that will help people kind of bring it to life and see how urgent of an issue it really is.
I totally agree. I think, like everything else, you need to speak the person's language. So meet them where they are. I would say that right there is how I can reach some people. That's my daughter, Gracie. She's almost 3 years old. Can you see that? Can you? I think you can probably see it in the corner. And some people can be reached through, hey, we got to leave the world a livable place for our daughters and sons, for our children and grandchildren. But I don't think everyone speaks that language. I think Chris is right. Some people speak the economic language. Here in Florida, the easiest way to get people to listen is to talk about how hurricanes are getting worse. Oh, and by the way, insurance premiums have like doubled, it tripled. I mean, they're like 4 times what the average homeowners insurance is across the United States here in Florida. People see it and it's a lot. Some people are being forced out of the state of Florida because they can't afford insurance anymore. So they That's an easy way to get them on board. Again, same thing though. You run into the same problem, which is okay, climate change is making hurricanes worse, but is it really us humans? You're still running into that pushback. Although, interestingly enough, despite the fact that Florida has become, a redder state than it was, the FAU has done studies, Florida Atlantic University, and shows that generally speaking, Floridians' understanding of climate change and even the understanding that humans are driving it is generally better than other states, which shows you what it means when you're living on the front lines of climate change. People here see the impacts of it a little more often. So I would say, in summary, talking about the things that people care about, and it's different everywhere.
Right. That makes sense. And you're in Florida, which is perhaps the state most vulnerable to climate change, on a wide range of metrics. So that
Yeah.
makes sense.
I mean, I just put out a study with the help of the Department of Energy. Really, it was their study, and then I localized it. We found that major hurricanes, and this may not happen, but it may. We found that by around 2066 on, and this was a difficult one to communicate because it's 40 years in the future. But we found that hurricanes from 2066 through 2100, major hurricanes could more than triple here in the Tampa Bay area. And that was the case for all of Florida. And what we also found, that's a questionable finding, I say, because it involves changing of circulation patterns, and I think it's hard for the climate models to know exactly how circulation changes may change in the future. But the two things we found that I think are probably even more alarming, because I think that you could realistically say they're probably true, is we found that maximum rainfall rates in the future will increase by about 50%. And maximum wind speeds in hurricanes are going to increase by around 15 to 20%. Both of those are very alarming findings because we already have evidence that both of those things are already changing in that direction. But whether or not storms are going to steer towards the U.S., I think that's harder to know for sure. But these results are alarming. And yet, I got to tell you, a lot of people were like, all right, well, why are you telling me something that's 40 years in the future? So I face that communication challenge every day.
So I know there was some discussion among scientists about creating a category 6 for hurricanes because we were already seeing hurricanes exceed what a category 5 normally is. Are you a proponent of that? Does that help magnify the risk in people's minds to have our categories actually rise up to that level?
I think it does what you say it does. It magnifies. I think it at least momentarily, when we say, all right, now there's going to be a Cat 6, people are like, oh boy, that means hurricanes are getting worse. I'm sure that fades though. You get an awareness spike and then it fades. I think there are a lot of meteorologists who don't think it's necessary because Cat 5s are already just cataclysmic. So honestly, I don't have a strong opinion on that. I do think it would help to raise awareness, at least initially. Chris, I'll let you chime in what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, I think it would be a short-term improvement. Look, we need tools to communicate this, and if that is one way that's effective, I think the social science aspect of it is important. It shouldn't just be meteorologists making these decisions. It should be social scientists that are able to take that public perception, public opinion on how it resonates with people and see if it's something that should be implemented, right? I'm on the fence, and I've felt the same about even naming heat waves. I've started to see a little bit of benefit, but when you have consecutive heat waves and considering heat waves are different or defined differently in different areas, that's a little bit difficult to do, right? So maybe it's using like a parameter like the climate shift index that Climate Central uses. Maybe if it's amplified by climate change by 5 times, then it's worthy of a name. Again, I think we really need to work with social scientists to really help better understand communicating. And I know this is fringe on what you said, Kathleen, but like the terminology of 100-year, 1,000-year events also really doesn't resonate with people. So those are things that we need to kind of partner with in the academic world and try to figure out.
So
I mean, this already, Kathleen. We're running into a partisan wall. You can speak to, forever about this stuff. It's really hard to break through a partisan wall, I think, an ideology wall. That's what I think the real problem is here. So you can think about a million ways to take this box and wrap it. Maybe we put the gift in a bag. That's what we're doing, right? We're thinking of different ways that we can kind of message. But the truth is once people, that who are not willing to accept climate change smell it as anything but, if they think that it's just simply a ploy to get them to understand. I think you understand where I'm coming from. I don't know how much we can accomplish with communication if people are so resistant to hearing the message, especially from people like, let's say, me or Chris, who, maybe we're not the best messenger. I mean, and what I mean by that is, so someone like Jim Gandy, great messenger, right? Is a longtime meteorologist, in a conservative place. People already trusted him for years. It's tougher when you take someone like me or Chris. Chris did most of his meteorology in Boston. I did a lot of my meteorology in New York City, although I spent half of my life in Florida. So, but anyway, you get what I'm saying? It may be more messenger related than it is communications, the type of communications and the way that we communicate.
I have to say, though, I was really heartened by those reams of emails that Chris held up on his last about the people who wrote in to thank him and to recognize that he had done something really difficult, which is bring this messaging into an area. And yes, you did have a death threat. And yes, you were accused of spreading a liberal propaganda. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, since this isn't television, I can say a libtard science, so the derogatory term for liberals, which again, it isn't. And Kathleen, I think the reason why I hopped on the opportunity to bring this back up a year after the event was no one was willing, no journalist was willing to kind of back up my story that I found a way to connect with viewers, the majority of viewers. This is just such a small fraction of people that were nightly listeners, by finding ways to connect with them on energy independence, which was using renewable energies and wind farms, and fiscal responsibility, and crafting it in a way that, why are we spending billions of dollars for these disasters for people to rebuild in a floodplain or in the same footprint of their home? And that worked. And no one would be willing to kind of go behind the scenes and find that my management, even though they hired me to do this, told me to stop talking about it. They did a total 180. And at that point, I didn't want it to seem like I walked out or gave up or I had enough. I was put up against a wall, and I wasn't going to be there not doing the job that I was hired to do. So
Understandable.
Yep.
So let's I'm going to just throw out one belief of mine, and you guys can let me know if it resonates with you. But so much of the pushback on the right on this issue originated because of the economics back in the 2000s, right? When the policy was wending through Congress, and it would have definitely been much more expensive to use green energy, and we definitely would have lost jobs, and we definitely would have been less competitive versus China. None of those are true anymore. And the reality is that clean energy and the transition actually creates more jobs than are currently in fossil fuels. And also, when you add in the cost of infrastructure, as you brought up, Chris, and the other costs of climate, it is so much more expensive to maintain our current path than to switch. And that is resonating more in conservative areas. It just hasn't necessarily trickled down through the entire political base. But if you talk to a lot of the people who are governing, they are understanding the economic benefits of this transition in places like Georgia and South Carolina, though they aren't quite standing on the rooftops to shout about it, but they are. So that does give me hope. I'd like to drill down one of the. Does that give you hope? I hope it does.
No, it does. And I was going to say there's a big difference between seeing tangible benefits 30 years from now and seeing tangible benefits 3 years from now. So the passage of the IRA brings jobs right away. But reducing carbon emissions doesn't bring immediate changes in the weather. And I think there's something to that as well. So, so couching this in jobs, and it is real. I mean, a lot of jobs are being created in a lot of especially red areas. There is a very quick, maybe not a political cycle, though. That's the problem. Why would politicians act on something if it's not within their political window and before the next election makes it a little harder. But in the case of this, the IRA, there are results happening within the time that the Biden administration is still actually in office, and big ones. So this is a way to talk about climate change and not actually talk about climate change, because it really is about the jobs, you know?
Let me just mention that when you say the IRA, it's the Inflation Reduction Act that is kind of named because it truly was the largest climate legislation that this country has ever enacted. So when we're talking about IRA, we're not talking about our savings account. When we're older, we are talking about this landmark bill. So could we take a minute to drill down on heat? Because I feel like heat is underappreciated. And the fact that the South is already as hot as it is and as projected to potentially have temperatures in the 130s by mid-century with a lot of humidity, that means a whole different world because it's not just a one-off, it's a whole season or it's an extended season. And that means so much for agriculture. That means so much for tourism. That means so much for human productivity. That means so much for, the strength of your transportation, on and on and on. Do you have that same impression that people are just kind of bear down on heat, saying, oh, it's hot, we just have to get through it, and they aren't translating it into the economic costs that it is bringing, and are not yet factoring in how much hotter it's going to get? Would you, I'm totally leading question there, and I'm sorry. Would you agree?
Chris, so I'll tell you that this was the most oppressive summer by some measure in Tampa's history. We've had 90 days with heat index numbers above 100. The average in the 1950s and 60s was only 20 days. We've had 80 days, and the average in the 1950s and 60s was 20, and the long-term average is 40. So you could see that there's been a huge escalation. I know from living here, it's getting oppressive. You don't want to go outside during the summer. But it's not yet to the point where people are like, I'm going to leave. I can't handle this. But I do think there are some people who do. They dream of living in like the mountains of, in the Carolinas, and some people do leave. I think it's people just hope that it happens slowly enough so that they can live out their life where they are. I think they view it as a gradual process, but I think people do realize legitimately that summers are getting unbearable here in Florida, and they're getting worse. I do think that they know.
And I think when you look at the impact of heat on the human body, that's really when you start dealing with health issues as well. And when that can be a threat multiplier, if you have cardiovascular or if you have respiratory related issues that are pre-existing. I worry that when the media covers heat oftentimes, and I will trash my former industry because my stations that I worked at were guilty of it. So many shots of people playing in sprinklers or out in the pool, and those are the visuals of people just having a great time. And I tried to find firefighters that were maybe fighting a fire in extreme heat, or people that were working in the utility industry that were dealing with the heat. But I think, unfortunately, it still is a problem for the lower class, the poor people in this country. And that's where the climate gap is most evident. When we have people that are spending a quarter or more of their salaries on heating and cooling costs, especially cooling costs, typically work these jobs that are excessive labor in these extreme conditions, go to a home that is not properly insulated, is not properly cooled, and then they're not able to cool off at night. It's this vicious cycle that you can't claw your way out of it. The people that are in the upper class, even the upper middle class, have the financial means to deal with it. And that's the problem. And I think once we really see that climate gap and how big it really is, heat's not going to get the headlines that it really should.
Yeah, but you mentioned something, and there was an article recently, and Chris, I don't know if you probably read it. I don't know who wrote it. It was about how air conditioning costs are going up. Now that's something that could get people's attention. Got my attention because I hadn't really thought about that very much. I just, oftentimes think about how oppressive it is, but that again is because I can pay for my air conditioning, and it's an incremental cost increase. But I think Chris hit the nail on the head. that there's such a disparity between the rich, and the poor.
Yes, that is a real part of this whole story around climate change. And I will just do an add-on though, is I think something that all talked about is the fact that this add-on of extra air condition is also part of what is threatening our grid. So we hear a lot about AI, we hear a lot about data centers, but it's also the increased energy needs we have just to stay safe that will continue to get higher and higher as we go into the century.
And I'll take that one step further, Kathleen. It's also a huge source of carbon emissions as well. So it's that vicious cycle. It keeps going around and around. So
absolutely. Yeah. So unfortunately, I have been told that I am past my time, and we are moving now to the Q&A from our audience. So let me grab it up. So here's a question from Fran Brady. Given the abundance of wildfires across the world, California, Canada, Portugal, and the Amazon region of Brazil right now, to name a few, how do you see these massive airborne particle generating effects affecting weather? Jeff, you want to take that one?
Yeah. Okay. So that is a tough one. It would be more of an effect on climate than weather, because it wouldn't be an effect on like tomorrow's weather necessarily. There would be obviously some. It's health effects, right? Because you end up with pollution in cities. So that's an effect on weather. But I think the question is probably more like, how is it going to affect the weather long term or the climate long term? Well, the more emissions that we produce, theoretically, and in terms of aerosols, so pollution, theoretically, the cooler it would make the climate. I don't know if we'll ever get to the point where we're producing so many fires that it's actually, though, cooling the climate. So, maybe, Chris, you have a better answer for this, because I don't know. I'm more worried about the debilitating health effects that are caused by the pollution from wildfires.
No, I agree. I mean, there is some evidence from my time in Iowa when we had fires out in California and Western Canada. We missed the forecasted high temperature by a fairly wide margin, and that was because of the aerosols, right? So you have smoke up there, as Jeff was mentioning, reflecting the sun's energy back out into space, and that had as a cooling effect. However, at night, it should keep things a little bit warmer because the heat won't really be able to escape back out into space. So as Jeff said, that's a really difficult topic. But I also would really just worry about it being a threat multiplier in the health space, because we had some of our biggest fires during COVID when ERs were overrun, and then they had a whole bunch of people with asthma, emphysema, COPD going in for poor air quality issues. So.
Right.
And the insurance, not so much smoke, obviously, but the insurance problems that we're seeing in many places, because wildfires are like hurricanes. They affect a certain area, and all of a sudden insurance companies pull out of the state. That's one of the first shoes to drop.
Right. Insurance is often called canary in the coal mine as far as this. And the first time you really see it in costs that you can tie together. So yes, definitely. So we have an anonymous question. Do you find that your younger audiences are more willing to accept changes caused by humans?
I guess I can talk about that. I think so, because the only people that complain are usually the older folks, and oftentimes people that may look a little bit like me, and maybe even slightly older than me. Just about all the people who complain are of a similar age category and a similar complexion, if you will.
Oh, okay.
I noticed. Yeah.
Um,
Chris, would you agree with me?
Yes, spot on. I mean, even in Iowa, even in some of the more conservative towns, there was this inspiring young lady who was from a really red part of Iowa. And she was one of the most vocal people I've ever met on climate change and did amazing work. So I think, yes, and even not just quote liberal younger people, but even the conservatives that are younger are interested in this and curbing CO2 emissions. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think there's some research that recently came out that said 40% of the younger generation are very concerned about climate change, and that's important. And it does show that younger conservatives are much more aware of and want leaders to act on it than the older cohort. So we do have some numbers to support that. Next question is, I have tremendous respect for climate science and meteorologists. Thus, I was surprised this morning that even the meteorologists were taken by surprise at the extent of the deluge in Carolina Beach, south of Wilmington, North Carolina. Is this part of a new reality? Even professionals can be taken by surprise by the extremity of these storms now and going forward. How can climate science improve the predictions in a changing world?
I think you have to expect the unexpected now, whereas you didn't have to years ago. Do you know, when I was in college, and this was back in the 90s, we were told, don't predict records. Never predict a record high. Never predict a record this. Why? Because they rarely ever happened. And so, you know, more often than not, you would end up losing in your forecast if you predicted a record. I would say the new rule is expect a record. You know, expect it to be worse than you expected it to be. That's, I think, but that is a slow generational change, even for meteorologists. Yes, we're seeing so many more of these floods. And I think it's apparent to anyone watching this, anybody even watching the news. We're seeing a lot. We've seen so many of these this year so far. I had 2 or 3 here in the Bay Area alone. I think the computer models probably underestimated this to a degree. I wasn't paying very close attention to this because it was in the Carolinas and that's not my forecast area. But I do think that these systems are systematically underestimated nowadays.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks.
And I do think some of the forecast models aren't doing great. I mean, they are, and climate projections are in a sense part of our operational forecast models, what we look at, which kind of run all of those mathematical formulas to help us determine what the next few days will look like. There are big improvements there. It's not looking just at climatological, past data. It's also factoring into the changes that we're seeing. But we are noticing, I mean, Harvey, I think, is even a better example of a storm that we didn't think was going to be that strong, but heck, ended up being a Category 4 storm and then dumped 50-some inches of rain. I don't think, Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think there was a model that sniffed out 54 inches of rain in any one side. Maybe close, but not to that magnitude.
Well, I don't think so. You're right. I don't think there was any model that showed that, but I can tell you days ahead, we were looking at the model saying, oh my goodness, look at how much rain is going to fall. They may have been predicting 3 feet, and yet someone ended up with 60 inches. Michael Rayner, who's a climate scientist who studies this kind of stuff, he estimates that at least 20% or around 20% more rain fell in Hurricane Harvey due to climate change. But when he did the calculations on how much extra damage was produced and how many extra homes were inundated because of that extra 20-ish% of extra rain, it turned out it ended up being almost half the cost of Hurricane Harvey. Because think about it, you get this much rain and this many homes flood, but then you get past a certain threshold, kind of like Hurricane Sandy when it came into New York City. You had 10 feet of storm surge. Well, it doesn't go over the battery, so you don't get any flooding in Lower Manhattan. You get 11 feet, and now all of Lower Manhattan is flooded because the water was able to breach the walls. And so there is a threshold for our infrastructure is built for in many places. And climate change is able to push you past the threshold where you go from having this much damage to having that much damage. That makes sense?
It makes a lot of sense. And let me follow up on that with a question from an anonymous participant about maximum rainfall rates are increasing during 100-year events as well as hurricanes. Can we expect more of what are called 100-year floods? But can we also explain what 1 in 100-year and 1 in 1,000-year and 1 in 500-year floods means, or storm means? Because it's bandied about. And it doesn't really mean that it's only going to happen 1 in 1,000 years. So can you answer the question and explain exactly what it knows?
Yeah, so the 100-year flood event, the chance on any given day of that flood happening is 0.01%. So then the 1,000-year flood is even more infrequent than that. But you're looking at kind of a static climate when you're making these assessments. And when you set up the 100 and 1,000-year flood events, and that just isn't the case anymore. I mean, infrastructure was built on the idea that our climate was stable, right? This is how much rain that this stormwater system should be able to take. Not the case anymore. So it's that kind of moving target that we're looking at. So it is pretty common now that we're seeing areas, and Jeff, I think you mentioned this a couple days ago when we were on a call. The place in Connecticut and the place in Long Island that had 2,000-year or two, like geographically so close together. And I think that really kind of paints the picture of just the frequency is increasing, and it isn't the best way to really communicate that risk anymore.
And it's happening more often in the Northeast than
Yeah.
it's anywhere else. We're seeing, and that's consistent with how the statistics have changed in the Northeast over the past 50 years. If you look at where the most extreme rain events are becoming more extreme, well, we're seeing something like a 50 or 60% increase in the most extreme rain events in the Northeast and Great Lakes, and less everywhere else. And sure enough, just looking at where we've seen most of the increase in extreme rain events this year, a lot of them are happening in the Northeast, Vermont, Connecticut, New York, that area. I had 2 here.
Right. It sure feels that way. We're up in Princeton and it definitely feels that way. So there's a really good question from Karen here, which is about and needing an explanation about what is happening to the jet stream. And I think I might add on to that question and say, what is also happening to our water currents? Because they're both changing and they have real implications for us if they change within, well, when they change, let me just put it that way, they will have real implications for us. So could we first talk about the jet stream and then also talk about some of the water currents that are also showing change?
Yeah, I can start with the jet stream and just say it is so complicated because even meteorologists have different ideas of what a jet stream is. And Chris, I'm sure, can understand where I'm coming from here. I oftentimes, when I look at the jet stream, I'm kind of looking at something called 500 millibars, which is like 20,000 feet in the atmosphere. But the real jet stream is even higher up than that. But the problem is the jet stream exists at different heights, different times a year, and at different latitudes. And so we're not all even talking about the same thing here. It's very possible that at one altitude, the jet stream ends up moving poleward closer to the North Pole because it's warming up there and the contrast is pushed closer. Whereas at another latitude, the jet stream ends up moving, maybe not moving north at all. It may just undulate more. So this is really, really, really complicated stuff. We know that things are changing. That probably the thing I would say most makes sense to me is that the jet stream is becoming more blocky because you get bigger pressure systems like high pressure, bigger heat waves. Well, you're going to slow the whole system down. So that makes a lot of sense. So from the standpoint of a jet stream, I think it makes sense, and we've seen some evidence of it, that we get more blocky, stuck patterns. Thus, we end up with more crazy floods like in North Carolina or in Poland and Austria, and heat waves that last longer because things are just not moving. But Chris, if you want to jump in, we can get back to, I know you want to talk about the AMOC, which is a completely different topic. So Chris, why don't you jump in on the jet stream?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to read more on this, Dr. Jennifer Francis, Woodwell Climate Research Center, one of the scientists that have done a lot of that. But as Jeff mentioned, when you have those wavier jet streams, if you take your garden hose and you could put a kink in it, what happens to the water coming out of it? It slows down. So that is some of the research that we're seeing. Jeff, do you want to start on AMOC or do you want me to?
Yeah, I just end with the jet stream, which is it's complicated, but
Yeah,
there's something big happening. But it's going to take a lot of time to get to the bottom of it for certain, because this is talking about atmospheric dynamics and physics and everything work. It's very easy when you're just putting more moisture into the atmosphere and causing more rain, right? That's an easy one. We know that happens with more. But when you're talking about jet stream stuff, you're talking about a whole lot of things that have to come together.
Can I ask one more thing about jet stream, though? I've heard some of the extreme cold that drops down to, say, Texas or lingers down has also been attributed to a weaker jet stream. So some of this unusual cold, does that have any credibility, or is that kind of?
People talk about it all the time. Extreme cold is not becoming more common, and those particular cold outbreaks are probably warmer than they were 100 years ago. But in certain instances, when you get blocking in the Arctic during certain times of the winter, yes, because of the excess blocking, you displace the jet stream to another area, which could be the United States or maybe in Europe, and you might, in fact, in certain situations, cause cold air outbreaks. But Those cold air outbreaks are not as cold as they were 100 years ago, given the, apples to apples comparison.
Thank you. So, and then do you want to explain what AMOC is? Because I'm not sure that our audience would be familiar with it. I think I sent you a curveball because that's not really your meteorological expertise, but
we both are very familiar with it, so we can.
Yeah.
so we're talking about the circulation through the Atlantic Ocean that goes up around Europe and then sinks back down. It's a conveyor belt for warm water to be brought to the north, and then it sinks down and the cold water comes down. And it's been something that's been very important to regulating our temperatures for a very long time, and it seems to be slowing down. And there's some concern that it may slow down to a point where there would be some really negative repercussions. It seemed to be something that was in the far, far off future that seemed scary, but that we have a lot of time to deal with. New research is showing that perhaps we don't have as much time to prepare for something like that. What are you guys hearing about it? And what are the weather implications if indeed this circulation continues to slow down?
You want to take it, Chris, or you want me to do it?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. So, I mean, you're looking at a couple of things driving it, right? So typically what moves currents are temperature differential, wind, but now we're starting to see this intrusion. One of the reasons why of snow melt and ice melt from the land glaciers and the land ice that's coming down, and that is affecting. And essentially, when you have a thin layer of fresh water on top of the salt water, it's actually heating up a lot faster than the salt water. So that is one of the key reasons too that we're starting to see this slowdown. And I think when people get caught up in the idea that, well, how does the ocean current affect our day-to-day life? Well, maybe not so much on the eastern seaboard, but places like Ireland and the UK. This is why those climates are survivable largely because of the AMOC current. And if it were to even slow, we're talking about impacts to agriculture that could drop yields in half in that part of the world, which would then leave a lot of climate refugees in that case. So, it's more than just the temperatures kind of evening out, which drops or slows the current, but we're also seeing that intrusion of fresh water into the oceans in the northern latitudes, which is concerning because that heats up that much quicker. Jeff, do you want to add anything else too?
Sure. And what you had mentioned, Kathleen, I think it's worth kind of reiterating. Used to be 10 years ago, scientific studies basically said the AMOC's not going to collapse. The Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation is not going to collapse. And if it does, it's not going to collapse until after 2100. But there have been a series of papers in just the past few years, 3-4 years, which say, now we think it may collapse. Oh, and by the way, it may happen sometime around 2050 or 2060, or maybe even before that. But the collapse doesn't happen overnight. It happens over the course of several decades. But there's a switch. It's like a light switch. It's an off or on. It'll slow, but at some point, it's like turning off a switch. And to turn that switch back on is thousands of years. So when we get to a point where we've tripped it, and who knows, we may have already tipped it, but if we haven't, it could be coming in the next couple of decades, which is what some of these studies say. If that would happen, Chris talked about it, which is we would see all that warm water from the Gulf Stream would no longer get to Ireland or Britain. So Northern Europe would go very cold, and that would change agriculture patterns and be devastating because it would happen somewhat quickly. Also, sea levels along the eastern seaboard would probably go up 2, maybe 3 feet more than they otherwise would have. Again, not in my lifetime. Probably not in my daughter's lifetime, but it's possible. But in her kid's lifetime, probably. And we don't honestly know. I mean, the northward heat transport globally, the AMOC contributes to something like 25% of that. So if you, and a lot of that is due to the Gulf Stream, if you stop that transport of warmth from the equator to the poles, there's going to be big changes. You're going to change where the intertropical convergence zone is, which oftentimes is where people in South America and in Africa rely on that water for crops. You might change hurricane seasons because you've moved the ITCZ. Point is we've never had something that systemic and catastrophic fail. So we don't really know exactly how bad it could potentially be if it were to happen. But the bottom line is science says that we could be just decades away from flipping that switch. Again, it wouldn't happen overnight, but once you flip the switch, you're heading in that direction, and that's it.
Okay. Thank you for that explanation. That is something that keeps me up at night. So I'm not sure that you made it better, but it's important for us to really understand just what you said is we are risking things that we don't even understand how bad they could become. And that is something that is truly sobering. So there are several more questions. Unfortunately, we are out of time, and I am so sorry about that because I think this conversation is so important, and I know that our audience has really been appreciative of having your expertise and your perspective. There is one question though that I just would love to ask. We're just going to slip it in as a lagniappe, as we say in New Orleans, which is, where do you see will be the safest places to live in the face of climate change?
Great Lakes, probably.
Yeah.
Honestly, Duluth has seen an incredible population boom. And that's largely because it's a climate haven where there's fresh water. That won't be an issue. Relatively temperate climate. That's one of the locations where there's actually been a large increase in people. And the New York Times actually did a great profile on that recently.
Yeah, I would say Chris is right. That makes sense to me. Places that aren't already too dry, because usually the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, right? So the places that are dry will get drier. The places that are getting fires, well, they're going to be in big trouble. Places that are going to hurricanes, probably big trouble. So just think about where those things are. But the Northeast, probably, honestly, those floods are getting really bad in many parts of the Northeast. So where's the place that's nobody escapes it? But I think Chris is probably right. That was my first thought, or parts of Canada. I mean, if you're talking about this part of the world.
Okay, well, on that happy note, before I close off, I just cannot thank our two guests enough. We so appreciated having you with us. I could keep on talking for another 2 or 3 hours, but that would not be fair to either of you. But I hope we can stay in touch and continue to learn from each other as we work to bring this important messaging forward in a way that more people can hear. So thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. And thanks to our audience, and we'll see you next time. Take care.